The house that America built. The secret history, Pennsylvania Avenue. Swamps, slaves, fire, and the building that never stopped reinventing itself. Prologue. What they don't show you on the tour. Let's start with something they don't put on the official tour. Somewhere beneath the floors of the most photographed house in the world. Beneath the Red Room, and the Blue Room, and the East Room where presidents have announced wars and signed treaties and wept at state funerals. They're old wooden beams with names carved into them, scratched into the lumber by the hands of craftsmen who worked on this building centuries ago and who understood, with the pragmatic clarity of men who spend their lives making things, that their work might outlast any official recognition of it. Some of those names belong to free workers, Irish and Scottish stonemasons who crossed the Atlantic for wages and opportunity. Others, and this is the part that complicates every postcard and every souvenir magnet sold in a gift shop, belong to enslaved men. Men who could be bought and sold. Men who built the home of American presidents while having no legal right to their own bodies, their own wages, or their own futures. This is not a footnote to the White House's history. It is the White House's history. And it is only one of the stories that the building's gleaming white facade has been asked to contain for more than 2 centuries. Here is another story the building carries. On the night of August 24th, 1814, British soldiers marched into Washington, sat down at the president's dining table, ate the meal that had been laid out and abandoned in the rush to evacuate, toasted the success of British arms using the president's own wine, and then set the house on fire. The building that was supposed to represent the permanence and authority of the American Republic burned to its stone shell while the president watched from across the river. And another. In 1948, a leg of the president's daughter's piano punched through the floor of her sitting room. When engineers came to investigate, they discovered that significant portions of the White House interior were being held up less by structural wood than by habit, paint, and the accumulated expectations of a building that everyone assumed was too important to fall down. The White House is the most recognized residential address in the world. Every child learns what it looks like before they can find it on a map. The neat white columns, the perfectly proportioned facade, the manicured south lawn, the fountain catching afternoon light. The image is so familiar it has become a kind of visual shorthand for American power itself. But the building that image represents is far stranger, far more complicated, and far more honest about America's contradictions than the official story usually admits. It was built in a swamp, by people whose names were mostly erased from the record. It was burned down and rebuilt in a rush of wounded national pride. It was held together by plaster and stubbornness for decades, past the point of safety. And it was the site of decisions, some noble, some catastrophic, most somewhere in the agonizing space between, that shaped the lives of billions of people who will never set foot inside it. This is the full story of the White House, not the version on the brochure. The version that the building itself, if it could talk, would tell you. Part 1. The dinner deal that created the swamp capital. Before there was a White House, there was a dinner party. And before there was a dinner party, there was a political crisis that threatened to split the young United States apart before it had fully managed to stick together. The year was 1790. The new federal government was barely operational. The Constitution had been ratified. The first Congress was meeting. George Washington had been inaugurated, and almost immediately the machinery of democratic governance had seized up over a question that would haunt American politics for generations: money. Specifically, the question of war debt. The Revolutionary War had cost money that the 13 individual states had borrowed from various lenders to finance. And Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant, ambitious, fiercely controversial Secretary of the Treasury, had proposed that the new federal government assume all of those state debts, pay them centrally, consolidate them under a single national obligation, and build the credit of the United States government on that foundation. Southern representatives were furious. States like Virginia had already paid down significant portions of their war debts. Assuming the debts of states that had not paid their obligations would mean Virginia's taxpayers helping to cover the costs of states that had been less fiscally responsible. The proposal was deadlocked, the government was paralyzed, and the fragile consensus that held the new nation together was beginning to strain under the pressure. Into this deadlock stepped Thomas Jefferson, recently returned from France, serving as Secretary of State and apparently unwilling to watch the new republic tear itself apart over a ledger. He arranged a private dinner at his residence on Maiden Lane in New York City. Hamilton was invited. So was James Madison, the influential congressman from Virginia who held the key to enough Southern votes to break the impasse. What happened at that dinner has been the subject of historical speculation ever since, partly because Jefferson himself described it differently at different points in his life. But the outcome is not in dispute. The men struck a deal. Hamilton would get his debt assumption plan. In exchange, the permanent capital of the United States will be placed not in an established northern city, not in Philadelphia or New York, with their existing infrastructure and their merchant elites and their proximity to the centers of early American commercial life, but along the Potomac River on territory carved from Maryland and Virginia, rooted firmly and permanently in the South. The political logic was elegant. Southern planters, including Washington himself, owned significant land in the region and stood to profit from the real estate speculation that would almost certainly follow the announcement. A Southern capital would reassure Southern states that the new federal government was not simply a vehicle for Northern financial interests. And a capital built from scratch in a wilderness could be imagined, at least in theory, as a pure symbol of Republican virtue, untouched by the commercial entanglements of older cities, designed from the ground up to embody democratic ideals. The practical reality was considerably less inspiring. The Potomac site was a stretch of tidal marshland, dense forest, and clay soil that flooded with reliable seasonal predictability. In modern terms, it was the kind of location that a sensible city planner would have rejected on first inspection. Hot, humid, mosquito-infested, and hours away from anywhere of real consequence. When Congress eventually had to work and live there, members would describe Washington City with a venom that suggested the distance between aspiration and reality was approximately the distance between the Capitol Dome and the nearest navigable road. On July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act, designating a 10-mile square federal district along the Potomac as the permanent seat of American government. Philadelphia would serve as the temporary capital for approximately a decade, while the new city was planned and built. Washington received broad authority to choose the exact location within the designated area and to oversee the construction of the federal buildings that would anchor the new capital. The United States was about to attempt to build a city from almost nothing in a place that nature had never intended for grand purposes. The president's house would stand at the center of that experiment, and the decision about what it should look like and who would design it was about to produce one of the more interesting architectural competitions in American history. Part 2, The Man Who Dreamed Too Big, and the competition that replaced him. The job of turning the swamp into a capital fell first to Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born military engineer who had served in the Revolutionary War and who possessed, in extraordinary measure, both the visionary ambition required for the project and the interpersonal skills that would guarantee his removal from it. L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March 1791, and what he saw in that waterlogged, uneven landscape was not a problem, but an opportunity. Where other men noticed mud and standing water and clouds of mosquitoes and a terrain that seemed designed to resist human ambition at every turn, L'Enfant saw something else entirely. The raw material for a city that would eventually dwarf anything in Europe. He had read the histories of Rome and Paris and Versailles. He had absorbed the Baroque tradition of city planning as theater, the broad avenues, the grand diagonal perspectives, the deliberate visual relationships between important buildings that made a capital feel like an argument about power rather than simply a collection of government offices. The plan he presented to Washington that summer was audacious in a way that made even Washington, a man not easily intimidated, pause before endorsing it. L'Enfant designed not for the fragile young republic that existed in that moment, but for the continental empire he believed America would one day become. Sweeping diagonal boulevards slashing across a grid of streets, radiating from key points in patterns borrowed from Versailles, grand public malls, and ceremonial spaces. Buildings positioned to create dramatic visual relationships across long distances. At the center of his vision were two great poles of Republican government. On Jenkins Hill, what we now call Capitol Hill, would rise the Congress House. Roughly a mile and a half to the northwest, on another prominent rise, would stand the President's House. These two buildings, L'Enfant insisted, should have clear visual lines to each other across a broad public mall. The connection between legislative and executive power made visible, permanent, and undeniable in stone and landscape. The president's house, in L'Enfant's imagination, was palatial in a way that would have given the anti-federalists heart attacks. He envisioned a residence approximately 5 times larger than the building eventually constructed, a sprawling complex worthy of state ceremonies and official receptions at a scale more appropriate to a European monarchy than a republic that had just finished fighting one. Set high on its hill, visible from the Potomac, it would function as a Republican palace that commanded the surrounding landscape in every direction. L'Enfant's vision was magnificent. L'Enfant's execution of the political dimensions of his role was catastrophic. He refused to compromise on elements of his plan when compromise was clearly necessary. He clashed repeatedly and bitterly with the commissioners appointed to oversee the city's development. He ordered the demolition of a manor house belonging to a nephew of one of the most powerful commissioners, apparently without anything resembling proper authorization, apparently without particularly caring about the political consequences of the act. The resulting dispute pushed tensions past the point of productive management. By February 1792, less than a year after he had presented his grand design, L'Enfant was dismissed. The commissioners kept the essential structure of his vision: the diagonal avenues, the siting of the major federal buildings, the general relationship between the Capitol and the president's house. But L'Enfant's more extravagant ideas were trimmed back, and the president's house in particular had to be reimagined as something more restrained, impressive enough to project dignity, not so lavish as to suggest a royal palace. That tension between Republican simplicity and national grandeur would shape every major decision about the building for years. With L'Enfant gone, the commissioners made a choice that would prove consequential in ways no one fully anticipated at the time. They would hold a public competition for the design of the president's house. In March 1792, advertisements ran in newspapers across the states, inviting architects and builders to submit plans for a residence that could house the president, his family, and an appropriate number of staff. The prize was $500 or a medal of equivalent value. Not a fortune, but significant enough to attract serious attention. And the entries that came in that spring and summer turned out to reveal something genuinely fascinating: how divided Americans were about what kind of house a president in a republic ought to inhabit. Some entries leaned into European palace traditions, proposing long multi-wing facades and ceremonial halls that would not have looked out of place in the residences of kings. These found no favor with commissioners who were acutely aware of accusations that the federal government already looked uncomfortably monarchical. Others swung to the opposite extreme, offering buildings so modest and plainly utilitarian that they could have housed a prosperous merchant as comfortably as a head of state. One particularly intriguing submission arrived from an anonymous designer who signed only with initials. The plan proposed a Palladian villa with a central rotunda and symmetrical wings, sophisticated, carefully proportioned, and unmistakably the work of someone with real architectural training and deep familiarity with Italian Renaissance forms. Later research identified this anonymous entry as the work of Thomas Jefferson himself, who apparently could not resist submitting his own vision of what the president's house should be, even while serving as Secretary of State. The commissioners recognized the Palladian style as Jefferson's. His admiration for those forms was no secret in Washington circles. Accepting his design would look like favoritism. Rejecting it openly would create a different kind of political embarrassment. The cleanest solution was to set it aside quietly and move on. As summer moved into autumn, the commissioners grew increasingly frustrated. None of the designs quite threaded the needle they were trying to thread. The building had to be substantial enough to command respect from foreign powers accustomed to dealing with kings. It had to be restrained enough to reassure American citizens that their president was a fellow citizen, not a monarch in waiting. It needed to echo classical Republican models while still working as a practical home for official business and private family life. It had to embody the entire paradox of American executive power: strong but limited, dignified yet democratic, permanent but never dynastic. The deadline passed with no obvious winner. The competition appeared to be drifting toward the embarrassing conclusion of having to be extended or abandoned. And then, A new design arrived from an unexpected direction. Part 3. The Irish immigrant who designed the most famous house in America. James Hoban was not famous. He was not connected to the established architectural circles of Philadelphia or New York. He was an Irish immigrant born around 1755 in County Kilkenny, who had trained as a builder and architect in Dublin before crossing the Atlantic in the mid-1780s and establishing himself in Charleston, South Carolina, where a thriving port economy was generating steady commissions for skilled tradespeople. His background was about as far from presidential grandeur as it is possible to get. Rural Ireland in the mid-18th century offered very little in the way of opportunity, especially for Catholics living under the penal laws that limited their right to own property, enter most professions, and participate in public life. What Hoban had was talent and determination. He apprenticed to a builder as a teenager, learned the trades of masonry and carpentry alongside the more refined skill of architectural drawing, and attracted the attention of patrons who helped him enter the Dublin Society's drawing school, where promising students studied classical design and Georgian proportion. During those formative years in Dublin, Hoban encountered a building that would leave a lasting mark on his architectural imagination. Leinster House, the grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster, completed in 1748. It was Georgian architecture at its most controlled and confident. A solid stone structure with precise symmetry, calm proportions, and restrained classical detail that projected authority without tipping into the heavy ornamentation of Baroque excess. For a young builder absorbing the visual language of refined construction, it was a near-perfect model. Architecture that announced permanence and dignity without making any of the claims that a royal palace would make. When the competition for the president's house was advertised in Charleston newspapers in the spring of 1792, Hoban recognized an opportunity that might not come again. He prepared his submission carefully, drawing heavily on his memories of Leinster House and reshaping its Georgian balance for an American Republican context. His proposal called for a three-story structure in stone, counting the raised basement, with a central entrance portico and evenly spaced rows of windows across the facade. The plan was fundamentally a refined rectangle. Large staterooms on the principal floor, family quarters above, service spaces below. Practical, dignified, and deeply rooted in the Irish-Georgian tradition Hoban had absorbed in Dublin. What distinguished Hoban's entry from the competitors was something that might be called architectural intelligence about the political moment. He had understood something that many of the other designers had missed. The commissioners were not simply choosing a building. They were choosing an argument. The president's house had to make a specific case about the nature of American executive power, and making that case required a very particular combination of impressiveness and restraint, visibility and accessibility, grandeur and democratic legibility. Hoban's Georgian idiom was already familiar to Americans from colonial public buildings and private houses. It read as established rather than experimental, classical without being foreign, solid without being royal. In a moment of sharp political division about what the presidency should look like, that kind of architectural diplomacy was probably exactly what the commissioners needed, even if they could not have articulated precisely why. The scale was also shrewdly calibrated. Hoban's building was large, genuinely large enough for state receptions and diplomatic events and the full machinery of executive hospitality. But it was not the overwhelming palace that L'Enfant had imagined. It could plausibly be built within a realistic budget and timeline, and it could function as an actual home as well as an official residence, which was, after all, what the president's house was supposed to be. When the commissioners met in July 1792 to evaluate the final entries, Hoban's design stood out not for breaking new ground, but for combining competence, clarity, and the right level of ambition. President Washington, who participated in the final selection, reportedly valued both the practicality and the dignity of the proposal. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years after the Residence Act had been signed, James Hoban was declared the winner. He received the promised prize of $500 and, far more significantly, the commission to oversee the actual construction of the president's house. The Irish immigrant from Kilkenny had secured the opportunity to shape America's most symbolic residence. The architectural work was done. The genuinely hard part, turning a clean design on paper into a real building rising from muddy, swampy, seasonally flooded ground, was only beginning. Part 4. Building the impossible. Swamp, stone, and enslaved hands. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone took place on October 13, 1792, in a Masonic ritual conducted by the Lodge of Georgetown. The formal speeches, the symbolic tools, the measured procedures of Masonic tradition gave the occasion an air of order and solemnity. In reality, they were blessing the start of an extraordinarily difficult construction project on a site that seemed designed by nature to resist it at every stage. The chosen location for the president's house sat on a modest rise above the Potomac floodplain. Not the dramatic hilltop that L'Enfant had once imagined, but high enough to offer some drainage and a clear view of the surrounding landscape. That slight elevation would prove crucial because the ground around it stayed persistently wet and unstable. Before a single foundation stone could be placed, the land had to be tamed. The site was thickly wooded. Crews spent weeks cutting trees, pulling stumps, and hacking through undergrowth before grading and leveling could begin. The clay-heavy soil turned into stubborn, sticky mud the moment it rained, and rain on the Potomac was a seasonal certainty. Workers dug drainage ditches to pull water away from the future basement, but those channels constantly needed maintenance and repair as the river's seasonal patterns tested every improvised solution. For much of the first year, more shovels than chisels were at work on the site. The ground had to be bullied into becoming something that could actually support a foundation before anyone could begin thinking about the building that would sit on it. The workforce that gathered on this muddy rise in the early 1790s was a reflection of the early American Republic in all its contradictions and inequalities. At the top of the labor hierarchy stood the highly skilled master craftsmen, primarily Irish and Scottish stonemasons and carpenters recruited by Hoban from Charleston and other port cities where immigrant craftsmen had settled after crossing the Atlantic. These men earned substantial wages for the time, often $1 or more per day, plus room and board. Their names appear repeatedly in the commissioner's account books. Colin Williamson, the Scottish stonemason who oversaw much of the exterior masonry. Philip Hart and John Sheehan, Irish carpenters responsible for shaping the interior woodwork. These were the skilled architects of their trades, and their expertise was irreplaceable. Below them worked journeymen and apprentices, men still developing their skills or not yet established enough to command the highest rates. They might earn 50 to 75 cents a day, decent income that could support a family and might, over time, provide the foundation for a rise to master status. And then there's the part of the story that the official histories long minimized and that the building's own foundations tell most honestly. From the very beginning, the construction of the president's house depended heavily on enslaved labor. The commissioners, always operating with limited funds and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote, unhealthy, and uncomfortable site, turned to the solution that Virginia and Maryland plantation owners already relied on whenever they needed many hands quickly. They hired out enslaved men from nearby plantations. The enslavers signed contracts lending their workers to the project for a month, a season, or an entire year. The commissioners paid the plantation owners. The men doing the digging, hauling, mixing, and lifting received nothing beyond the most basic food and shelter. The records document this system with the cold precision of people who saw nothing remarkable in it. Payments to specific plantation owners for Negro hire. Money recorded against the names of enslavers, not against the people doing the work. When the men themselves appeared in the ledgers at all, they were typically reduced to a repeated phrase that stripped them of individuality and humanity simultaneously. Negro hire. People were rendered into line items. Workers were cataloged as categories of cost. These enslaved men performed some of the most physically demanding and dangerous work on the entire site. They quarried stone, hauled the massive blocks across difficult terrain, mixed mortar in the summer heat, dug the drainage ditches that kept the building site from flooding, cleared trees, and removed stumps, and carried the relentless burden of any large construction project. The slow, grinding work of moving heavy material from where it arrived to where it was needed, day after day, season after season. So brought real skill. The historical record, when historians began searching it carefully, which did not happen seriously until the 1970s and 1980s, reveals enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and stonemasons whose craftsmanship matched that of the free workers they labored alongside. Their expertise was indispensable. Their compensation went to someone else. A man hauling stone blocks under the summer sun above the Potomac, wearing inadequate clothing, eating rations calculated for minimum cost rather than adequate nutrition, working in conditions that would test modern construction crews equipped with safety gear and enforced labor protections. That man built the home of American presidents while having no legal claim to his own labor, his own wages, or his own person. That is not a metaphor or an abstraction. It is what happened. And it happened on the same ground where the President of the United States would later sign legislation about American freedom. The main building material, Aquia Creek sandstone, quarried in Stafford County, Virginia, roughly 40 miles south of the construction site, arrived by barge up the Potomac. The river route was essential. The rough dirt roads of the 1790s could never have supported the weight and volume of stone required. At the quarries, workers split blocks along the stone's natural grain using hammers, wedges, and iron bars. These rough pieces, some weighing several hundred pounds, were maneuvered onto barges using wooden cranes and levers and then floated north toward the building site. By the time blocks arrived at Georgetown's wharfs, many had chipped edges or hairline cracks from the journey. They needed trimming and squaring before they could become part of wall. Skilled stonemasons transformed them into ashlar, the clean rectangular stones that give the building its ordered, dignified appearance. A single block might require hours of patient chiseling, checking against straight edges, refining the visible face until it matched the specifications in Hoban's drawings. A stone cut, even slightly wrong, could not be patched. It was discarded, taking with it all the labor already invested. The walls rose slowly, agonizingly slowly by modern standards, where construction projects of comparable scale might be completed in months. The work did not stop for weather, but bent under it. Washington's summers brought oppressive heat that bounced off pale stone and turned the construction site into something close to an oven. Winters brought freezing wind that made fresh mortar vulnerable to cracking and turned every day of outdoor work into a test of endurance. Progress stalled regularly. Funding delays prevented the purchase of materials. Shortages of skilled labor forced constant reshuffling of tasks. The remote site made it difficult to attract and retain the workforce the project demanded. Yet, step by step, the structure emerged. By the autumn of 1800, the exterior walls were up. The roof was on. The building had a recognizable presence on its low hill above the Potomac. It was, in most important respects, still a construction site. But the government had run out of time to wait for it to become anything more. Part 5. The First Residence, a cold, unfinished house and a president's prayer. The agreement that had given Philadelphia a decade as the temporary capital expired in 1800, and the federal government was obligated to move to the new city on the Potomac whether or not the city was ready to receive it. It was not. President John Adams arrived at the president's house on November 1st, 1800, becoming the first chief executive to sleep under its partially completed roof. The building that awaited him was, and there is no more precise way to put this, only barely a house. 6 rooms had been plastered into something approaching habitability. The planned grand portico on the north front had not been built. Visitors climbed temporary wooden steps instead. The interior staircases were unfinished. Outside, the grounds were a chaos of timber stacks, clay heaps, broken stone, and workers' temporary shelters. The city surrounding the house barely existed, a collection of scattered buildings connected by muddy tracks through forest clearings, with almost none of the infrastructure that even the most modest urban life requires. Adams, a man of considerable dignity and considerable stubbornness, made the best of it. On his first night in the building, he wrote to his wife Abigail with a prayer that has since been carved into the state dining room mantelpiece, and that captures something real about the aspirations being invested in a building that was, at that particular moment, a glorified construction site. I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. Abigail Adams arrived several weeks later, and her response was considerably less poetic. In letters to friends and relatives, she described a domestic situation that tested the limits of the word improvising. The house was cold in ways that a handful of working fireplaces could barely address. Firewood in the new capital was scarce and expensive. Outside the mansion, there was almost nothing. No established shops, no reliable services, no community of any kind to support a household of this scale. Her most memorable adjustment to the unfinished building has become one of the more humanizing details in the early White House's history. The East Room, the largest space in the building, designed for grand receptions and state ceremonies, was bare, unfinished, and entirely unusable for anything formal. So Abigail turned it into a laundry room. The ventilation was good, the space was vast, and the president's sheets, shirts, and undergarments needed somewhere to dry. For the first months of the White House's existence as a presidential residence, the room that would eventually host inaugural receptions and state dinners and the lying-in state of presidents was filled with damp linen strung on makeshift lines. The domestic staff managed the basics through continuous improvisation. Servants hauled water by hand from nearby springs because the house had no plumbing of any kind. Cooking happened over open fires in the basement kitchen, with hot dishes carried up narrow, unfinished stairways to wherever the family was eating. Official entertaining, such as it was, happened in cramped settings that fell dramatically short of what diplomatic protocol required. Adams had 4 months in the unfinished house before his time ran out. He lost the bitterly contested election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, his former political ally turned sharp political enemy, and reportedly left Washington before dawn on Inauguration Day, rather than remain to witness his successor's swearing in. The job of turning the president's house from a barely habitable shell into something approaching its intended grandeur would fall to Jefferson, a man of extraordinary architectural sophistication and extraordinary personal contradiction who would leave lasting marks on both the building and on the moral accounting the building has never quite been able to escape. Part 6, Jefferson's White House, Elegance, Ideology, and the Slavery No One Talked About. Thomas Jefferson came to the president's house in March 1801 with very strong opinions about architecture and very complicated feelings about the building he was moving into. He had, after all, tried to design the building himself. His anonymous competition entry, a Palladian villa with Italian Renaissance proportions that he had admired as American minister to France, had been quietly set aside by commissioners who almost certainly recognized whose hand was behind the anonymous submission and who found it more convenient to decline the proposal without creating the political awkwardness of a public rejection. Now Jefferson was living in James Hoban's solid Georgian mansion, which he privately found a bit dull. It was competent, dignified, well-scaled. It was not what Jefferson would have designed. Being Jefferson, he immediately began improving it. His most significant structural additions were the east and west terraces, low colonnaded wings extending from either side of the main block. In Jefferson's mind, these wings were solutions to multiple problems simultaneously. They provided elegant classical colonnade details that he thought the building needed. They screened the utilitarian outbuildings, stables, with storage, service areas, behind architectural forms that contributed to the overall composition rather than cluttering the grounds. And they connected the main residence to its support structures without scattering separate buildings across the landscape in a way that would look disorganized from any approach. Inside, Jefferson turned his attention to rooms that Adams had left barely functional. He supervised the purchase of furnishings, often choosing French pieces that reflected his years in Paris. He approached the grounds with the same passionate attention he gave to Monticello's gardens, planting trees, laying out vegetable plots, imagining the president's house landscape as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate, where productivity itself served as a symbol of Republican virtue. He left the East Room alone. Jefferson had no interest in grand ceremonial gatherings. He preferred smaller, more controlled settings, the carefully managed dinners at which he would seat guests of opposing political factions next to each other with studied informality, mixing them and mixing ideas in spaces that felt like genuine conversation rather than official performance. He would rather invest in his writing rooms and his library than rush to complete a ballroom whose intended function he found essentially foreign to his temperament. And then there's the part that the building's gleaming white facade was always quietly containing. Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello to Washington to work in the president's house. They cooked in the kitchen. They managed the household. They maintained the residence that housed the man who had written the sentence, "All men are created equal," and who had, in the subsequent 4 decades of his life, demonstrated a complicated and ultimately catastrophic unwillingness to act on its implications. The construction work during Jefferson's 2 terms followed the same pattern established from the beginning. The terraces he added, the landscape improvements he ordered, the interior finishing he oversaw, all of it rested on a mixed workforce of free craftsmen who could leave and enslaved workers who could not. Some of those enslaved workers were highly skilled. Their compensation, whatever form it took, went to the people who claimed to own them. Jefferson was not naive about this contradiction. His private writings acknowledged slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the republic he had helped create. He wrote about it with the anguish of a man who understood what he was doing and continued doing it anyway. That anguish took physical form in the president's house, a structure meant to embody the principles of human equality, maintained in large part by people whose basic humanity the law refused to recognize. Jefferson served 2 terms in the unfinished mansion, refining it as he went, leaving it considerably more habitable and considerably more elegant than he found it. The terraces, the landscape, the carefully chosen French furnishings, the organizational improvements to the interior layout, all of these would outlast his presidency and shape how his successors experienced the building. The moral compromise built into the house from the first day of construction would also outlast him, sitting quietly in the stone and the service corridors and the records of hired enslaved labor, waiting for future generations to decide whether they wanted to acknowledge it. They would be given a very specific kind of pressure to do so. Because within 3 years of Jefferson leaving office, the building he had improved with such care would be invaded. Its furniture, burned by the people he had sat down to a meal with and attacked, would be burned to its shell, and the entire project of the American Capitol would be forced to reckon with whether it had the resilience to survive its first genuine catastrophe. Part 7. The Night They Burned It Down, 1814. The War of 1812 had been dragging on for more than 2 years with no decisive resolution when British strategy changed dramatically in the summer of 1814. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe. Veteran troops were now available for other theaters. British commanders decided to strike directly at the American capital, a calculated blow designed not to hold territory, but to humiliate the young republic into accepting better peace terms than American battlefield performance had earned. By August 24th, 1814, British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn had landed in Maryland and begun their march toward Washington. The American defense, improvised and poorly coordinated, collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg, a defeat made historically notable by the presence of President James Madison, who had actually ridden out to observe the fighting, making him the only sitting American president to personally witness combat while in office. He watched the American militia break and run before disciplined British regulars. With the defenders scattered and the road to Washington open, Madison rode back to the city to find a capital in panicked retreat. At the president's house, his wife Dolly Madison was directing one of the most celebrated rescue efforts in the building's history. As British troops approached, she oversaw the packing of key government documents and insisted on saving Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington, a canvas screwed firmly to the wall of the state dining room. Rather than waste precious time unscrewing it, her servants smashed the frame and cut the canvas free. That single act of cultural preservation, carried out while an invading army was hours away, fixed Dolly Madison's place in the story of the White House permanently. British officers led by Admiral Cockburn entered the mansion that evening and found it empty, but set for dinner. Whether the meal had been prepared in the hope that Madison might return, or simply abandoned in the chaos of evacuation, has never been definitively established. What is certain is that the officers did what military men do when they find food. They sat down and ate it. Seated at the American president's table, using the president's silverware and drinking from the president's wine supply, they reportedly toasted the success of British arms before getting up to burn the house down. The deliberate destruction that followed was not random vandalism. It was targeted demolition of government infrastructure. Soldiers dragged furniture into piles, added books, papers, curtains, and anything else that would burn readily, and set fires throughout the mansion. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls, which had taken so long to raise and which would prove so difficult to destroy, could withstand the flames. Everything inside them was wood. Floors, staircases, roof timbers, window frames, door frames, wall paneling. Once the fires caught, the interior burned ferociously. Heat built until glass shattered, beams snapped, and whole sections of flooring crashed down into the basement. A violent summer thunderstorm rolled over the city that night, the kind of brutal Potomac storm that descends with little warning and dumps extraordinary quantities of water in a short time. Some historical accounts suggest that this storm may have prevented the stone walls themselves from being more severely damaged, dousing fires before they could compromise the structural masonry. Even so, the president's house that dawn revealed on August 25th, 1814, was a ruin. From the outside, the building still stood, its stone walls blackened and cracked by heat. Inside, it was a shell. Staircases had collapsed. Floors had given way. The roof was mostly gone. Everything Jefferson had carefully assembled. The French furnishings, the organized interior, the terraces, the gardens had been burned, looted, or trampled. The British stayed in Washington for approximately 24 hours. In that time, they also burned the Capitol, the Treasury, and several other government buildings, then withdrew. They left behind a capital city physically wrecked and a young nation confronting a question that had not been on the table before. Could a republic that had just watched its capital burn stay the course? Or would this be the moment when the American experiment revealed its true fragility? Part 8. Rising from the Ashes and How the House Got Its Name. In the days after the British attack, with smoke still drifting from the ruins of the president's house and the Capitol building, Congress faced a political argument that might have seemed, from the outside, almost absurd given the circumstances. Should Washington survive as the capital at all? Some representatives argued that the fire had exposed the original mistake, placing the nation's seat of government in a remote, mosquito-infested marshland that was apparently unable to defend itself against a relatively small British raiding force had been the wrong decision from the beginning. Moving the capital to Philadelphia, or New York, or some more established and defensible city farther west, would be an honest acknowledgement of a bad original choice. The counter-argument was blunter and ultimately more persuasive. If the United States abandoned its capital because the British had burned it, the British would have won something far more significant than any battlefield engagement. Walking away would demonstrate to Europe and to every faction within America that questioned the Republic's stability that the young nation lacked the resilience to absorb a setback and continue. The decision was made to stay and to rebuild, and it was made quickly enough to suggest that most of the representatives who debated it had never seriously considered any alternative. James Hoban, now in his late 50s, established in Washington with a solid reputation and a web of professional relationships built over 2 decades, was called back to lead the restoration of his greatest work. Surveying the ruins of the building he had designed through a British-funded winter of 1814 and into 1815, Hoban and his team made a careful assessment of what remained. The conclusion was both encouraging and sobering. The encouraging part: the exterior sandstone walls were structurally sound. Smoke-stained, heat-cracked in places, aesthetically damaged, but fundamentally solid. The original masonry had held. Jefferson's terraces, though damaged, were reparable. The bones of the building were still there. The sobering part: virtually everything else was gone. Floors, staircases, roof timbers, interior partitions, window frames, doors. All the wood that had transformed the stone shell into a livable building had burned. What lay ahead was not repair work, but essentially a full interior reconstruction, as demanding in its own way as the original construction had been. Congress appropriated funds, first insufficiently, then with supplementary appropriations as the true cost became apparent, and construction began in earnest in the spring of 1815. The workforce looked familiar. Irish and Scottish stonemasons handled the masonry. American carpenters managed the new framing and finish work. Enslaved laborers hired from Maryland and Virginia plantations provided much of the heavy labor. Some of the craftsmen who had worked on the original building 2 decades earlier returned, bringing something that no drawing could provide: direct personal memory of how the house had first been put together. The most consequential single decision of the entire reconstruction concerned the exterior stone. The fire had left the Aquia Creek sandstone discolored, more porous, and marked by smoke staining that no amount of cleaning was going to fully remove. Some stones had cracked and required replacement. But tearing down and rebuilding the entire exterior was neither necessary nor affordable. Hoban proposed a different solution: coat the whole exterior in white paint. This was not merely cosmetic, though it was that too. A thick layer of lead-based white paint would seal the stone against weathering, slow the deterioration that the fire had accelerated, and give the walls a consistent, clean surface that concealed the most visible damage. At the same time, it transformed the building's appearance. Instead of the pale, modestly varied color of natural sandstone, the house now presented as a strikingly bright, uniform white, visible from considerable distances across the still sparse Washington landscape. Impossible to miss. Even before the burning, some observers had occasionally referred to the building informally as the White House, likely because of the naturally light color of the sandstone. After Hoban's reconstruction, with the exterior deliberately and completely whitened, the nickname became essentially unavoidable. The bright facade stood out against the landscape with a clarity that made the informal name feel both accurate and inevitable. The title White House would not become the official designation until President Theodore Roosevelt formalized it in 1901. But from 1817 onward, the visual identity it described was unmistakable. The reconstruction moved at a pace that surprised everyone who had lived through the slow, grinding process of the original construction. Wounded national pride was a powerful accelerant. President James Monroe and his family moved back into the restored house in November 1817, less than 3 years after the burning. They walked into a building that was, in many important respects, better than what had existed before. The interiors were more refined. The circulation made more practical sense. The deliberately whitened exterior pulled the composition together with a visual clarity it had never quite achieved before the fire. The building now told a story that Americans badly needed in 1817. The Republic had been attacked. The Republic had been burned. And the Republic had rebuilt, visibly and defiantly, in a form the whole world could see. Part 9. A century of changes, porticos, plumbing, and electricity. The reconstructed White House of 1817 was, by the standards of its era, a genuinely impressive building. But it was also the beginning of a long and sometimes desperate relationship between an aging structure and the relentlessly expanding demands being placed on it. Over the following century, the house would be continuously modified, updated, and adapted, and the gap between its historic exterior and its creaking interior would eventually grow into a genuine structural crisis. The most important architectural additions of the early 19th century came under Hoban's continued oversight in the 1820s and early 1830s, as he finally realized portions of his original 1792 scheme that had never been built. The south portico came first, completed in 1824. It created the now iconic curved colonnade on the garden side of the building, an elegant semicircle of tall Ionic columns that provided ceremonial shelter for what had become a principal entrance and gave the mansion's garden facade a dramatic, stage-like quality. That graceful curve, which would eventually anchor thousands of photographs and countless moments of American political theater, had been waiting in Hoban's original drawings for more than 30 years. The north portico followed in 1829, taking a different and more utilitarian form. Where the south portico swept in an elegant curve, the north portico was a straightforward rectangular porte-cochere, a covered carriage entrance designed for practicality as much as appearance. The north side faced the city and received the majority of official visitors, so the emphasis there was appropriately functional. Together, the two porticos completed the compositional scheme Hoban had envisioned from the beginning, giving the building the balanced, formal profile that would define its silhouette for generations. Critics complained that the porticos made the president's house look too European, too close to a royal palace for a country that had fought a revolution specifically to reject monarchy. By the 1820s, those objections carried considerably less weight than they had in the Republic's anxious early years. The nation's confidence had grown. The fear that a few more columns would somehow transform a president into a king had faded. Americans had begun to develop the particular relationship with the White House's appearance that would eventually make any significant visual change feel almost like a constitutional violation. Inside, the building never stopped changing. Every administration left its mark. New furniture, different fabrics, fresh paint, updated decor. The East Room, Abigail Adams's improvised laundry, unfinished through multiple presidencies, was finally developed into a genuine state reception room during Andrew Jackson's administration in the 1830s, and from that point forward, it served something approaching its original intended function. Technology arrived more slowly, but transformed daily life far more fundamentally than any new wallpaper scheme. Running water came in the 1830s, ending the constant hauling of heavy buckets from outdoor pumps and wells. By later standards, the system was elementary. But for the people living and working inside a house of this scale, it was transformative. Gas lighting arrived in the 1840s under President James K. Polk, replacing candles and oil lamps with the softer, warmer, more consistent glow of gas fixtures. For decades, gas and older lighting methods coexisted, with gas reserved for the principal rooms and traditional lamps still serving many secondary spaces. Electric lighting was installed in 1891 during Benjamin Harrison's administration. The White House was not an early adopter by national standards. Parts of Washington had enjoyed electric light for nearly a decade. But wiring a building that had never been designed for cables and switches required threading electrical lines through thick masonry and old framing, a substantial renovation project. The Harrison family reportedly approached the new technology with genuine suspicion. Stories from the period describe them avoiding the light switches out of concern about electric shocks, occasionally leaving lights burning through the night simply because no one wanted to risk turning them off. The house had entered the electrical age. Its occupants were taking a little longer to adjust. Steam heating, threaded through the building from basement boilers and stages beginning in the 1850s, made the house dramatically more livable as a year-round residence and ended the constant, inefficient, and unevenly effective system of individual fireplaces that had heated, or failed to heat, the building for its first half-century. Each of these upgrades was significant on its own. Together, they transformed the daily experience of living and working in the White House. What they could not do was address the slow, accumulating structural problem that each successive addition was quietly worsening. The president's house was being asked to carry more weight, more vibration, more people, and more technology than its original designers had imagined. And the building's bones, the wooden joists and beams that had been holding up the floors since Hoban's post-fire reconstruction in the 1810s, were aging without anyone paying systematic attention to what aging meant for a structure this old and this loaded. By the early 20th century, the gap between the White House's gleaming exterior and its deteriorating interior had become serious. The building just didn't know it yet. Or more precisely, the people living in it preferred not to know. Part 10. The piano leg that nearly brought down the White House. Theodore Roosevelt launched the first major 20th century overhaul of the White House in 1902, 3 years after taking office. His renovation was focused primarily on function and organization rather than structural repair. He created the West Wing, pulling official offices out of the family's living quarters and giving the executive branch's daily operations a dedicated space separate for where the first family tried to sleep and eat and live something resembling a private life. That reorganization was significant and enduring, but did not address the building's deepening structural problems. The interior of the White House had been accumulating problems for decades. Every administration had carved new spaces out of old ones, added staircases, installed elevators, inserted increasingly heavy mechanical and communications equipment. The wooden joists and beams that formed the skeleton of the building's floors and ceilings, many of them dating to Hoban's reconstruction in the 1810s, were bearing loads and vibrations they had never been designed to carry. Plaster ceilings sagged in unsettling curves. Floors flexed noticeably underfoot. During large events in the East Room, guests could reportedly feel the floor vibrating and watch the chandeliers sway with the movement. Presidents complained. Reports were filed. Inspections were ordered. And then, because the business of government could not stop for a building renovation, because finding a suitable alternative temporary residence was politically complicated, because admitting that the most famous house in America might actually be dangerous seemed somehow unacceptable. The problems were acknowledged and set aside. The White House continued to serve as the center of American executive power, while its structural condition quietly moved from concerning to alarming. The breaking point came during Harry Truman's presidency in 1948 in a way that was almost comedically specific. The leg of Margaret Truman's piano punched through the floor of her sitting room on the second floor of the White House. Engineers who came to investigate the damage made a discovery that should probably have been made considerably earlier. Significant portions of the White House interior were, at that point, being maintained in position less by actual structural integrity than by the accumulated weight of habit, paint, plaster, and the collective institutional assumption that a building this important could not possibly be on the verge of collapse. Some beams were no longer bearing their loads in any meaningful structural sense. Plaster and tradition were doing more work than wood in certain areas of the building. The White House had been, for years, a building that was essentially too famous to be allowed to fail, and that implicit protection had permitted its actual structural condition to deteriorate past the point of responsible neglect. Truman responded with his characteristic directness. In 1949, the first family moved across Pennsylvania Avenue to Blair House, and crews began the most extensive preservation project in the White House's history. The renovation that followed was not a remodeling. It was a near-total rebuilding hidden inside an historic exterior. Workers dismantled the interior room by room, carefully labeling and preserving every element: doors, mantels, paneling, decorative plaster, fireplace surrounds, that could eventually be returned to its proper position. Under the building, crews excavated new basement levels to accommodate modern mechanical systems that the original construction could not have imagined. Within the original stone shell, engineers erected a full steel frame, a new, modern structural building constructed inside the historic box. As walls were opened and floors removed, the house gave up secrets that the building's official history had largely overlooked. Old beams yielded names and dates and brief messages carved by craftsmen who had worked on the original construction and on Hoban's post-fire rebuilding. Men who had understood, with the practical foresight of people who make things with their hands, that their signatures in the wood were more likely to survive than any entry in an official record. Workers in the subterranean areas uncovered artifacts from the mansion's earlier life: fragments of pottery, discarded tools, pieces of the original building materials. Each find added another small piece to the puzzle of how the house had actually been built and used across its first century. The reconstruction took nearly 4 years and cost more than $5 million, a figure that astonished observers and that reflected both the scale of the work and the level of care required to preserve the building's historic character while rebuilding its structural reality from the ground up. When the Truman family returned in 1952, they were walking into what was, in practical terms, a new house wearing an old face. The rooms looked largely as they had before. Behind the period paneling and ornate plasterwork stood 20th century steel, concrete, and modern systems. The White House had been saved, and in the process of saving it, the renovation had exposed something that the building's history had been quietly preserving all along: the evidence of whose hands had actually built and maintained the most famous house in America. Part 11. The Names They Erased, Recovering the Hidden History. For nearly 2 centuries after the first cornerstone was laid, the official history of the White House told a story about presidents and architects and a handful of celebrated craftsmen. The enslaved men who helped build and operate the house were, at best, background detail, and at worst, entirely absent. Their absence from the record was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate habit of American historical memory that preferred to look away from the most uncomfortable truths embedded in its proudest national symbols. The effort to recover those missing stories began seriously only in the 1970s and 1980s, when historians shaped by the broader movement towards social history that centered the experiences of people who were not powerful, not wealthy, and not recorded in the documents that powerful and wealthy people generated, began reading the old records with new questions. The commissioner's account books from the 1790s and early 1800s, preserved in the National Archives, proved crucial. Page after page contained payments to plantation owners for Negro hire. These ledgers had always been available, They had simply not been read with the specific intention of understanding what they revealed about who had actually built the building. When historians read them that way, the conclusion was inescapable. Enslaved labor was not a marginal or incidental contribution to the construction of the president's house. It was central from the first days of grading the site to the final phases of interior finishing. The next step, moving beyond the cold accounting entries to find real names and actual lives, was considerably harder. It required the kind of cross-referencing that turns historical research into something resembling detective work. A payment to a specific plantation owner for the hire of a specific number of enslaved men could be matched, sometimes, with plantation records that listed individuals by name, trade, and age. An entry in the construction ledgers for 5 Negro men might be connected through other documents to specific people known to have been enslaved in the area and known to possess the relevant skills. Slowly, painstakingly, first names gained trades and locations and fragments of biographical context. The research revealed something important beyond the basic fact of enslaved labor's presence. This was not only brute force work. Some enslaved workers brought expertise that matched or exceeded that of the free craftsmen they worked alongside. Enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and stonemasons contributed skills that were genuinely indispensable to the project. Their compensation, in every case, went elsewhere. The records also hinted at the human cost beneath the stone and mortar. Construction in the 1790s was dangerous for any worker, but enslaved men faced the same physical risks with fewer protections and no recourse. A free laborer injured on the job could refuse to continue, demand different conditions, or walk away. An enslaved man had no such options. He was expected to work until he was physically unable to do so. The account books occasionally record payments to plantation owners for enslaved workers who were permanently injured or killed. Compensation for damaged property. In the language of the ledgers, not acknowledgement of a human life ended or ruined by dangerous work. The historical record also reveals that the White House's reliance on enslaved labor did not end when the walls were finished and the scaffolding came down. Throughout the antebellum period, enslaved workers kept the building functioning day to day. They cooked in its kitchens, maintained its fires and lamps, tended its gardens and stables, and served its residents. Presidents from slaveholding states brought in slave servants to Washington, adding additional layers of contradiction to a building that was simultaneously the symbolic heart of a republic claiming liberty as its founding value in a domestic space where human beings were bought, owned, and directed. Andrew Jackson conducted the business of the presidency while being attended by people he legally owned. So did James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, and others. Human beings were bought and sold and ordered about inside the official home of a government that described itself to the world as the most advanced experiment in democratic self-government in human history. In 2016, Michelle Obama addressed this history directly from the East Room podium. The same room where Abigail Adams had hung her laundry, where Abraham Lincoln had lain in state, where the most consequential announcements of American executive power had been made for 2 centuries. I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves, she said. For some viewers, the statement was startling. For historians who had been working with the archival evidence for decades, it was simply accurate. In the years following, official White House tours began acknowledging the enslaved workers' contributions more directly. A commemorative marker was installed to honor those who had helped build the house. Exhibits and publications started including their stories alongside those of the presidents and first ladies who had long dominated the building's official narrative. The work is far from complete. Many names are gone forever. Many stories exist only as inference from scattered fragments of evidence. But the effort to bring these people back into the building's narrative is not simply an academic project. It is a reckoning with what the White House actually represents. Not just the American ideals of democracy and equality, but also the long and painful distance between those ideals and the realities that have been built into the building's very foundations. Epilogue: what 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue actually means. The White House today functions simultaneously as 3 different things, and the tensions between those functions are never fully resolved. It is a museum, a historic structure preserving more than 2 centuries of American presidential history. Visitors who have never been inside know the rooms from photographs and films and news coverage. The State Dining Room, the East Room, the Lincoln Bedroom, the Oval Office. These spaces have become part of the shared visual vocabulary of American civic life in a way that no other building in the country has achieved. It is a working office building where the daily business of executive governance continues against a backdrop of priceless antiques and irreplaceable historic fabric. Staff navigate between 18th century furnishings and contemporary communications technology. Ceremonial spaces and functional work areas share the same floors. Every structural modification must negotiate between historic preservation requirements and the constantly evolving demands of modern government. And it is an actual home where the first family attempts to maintain some version of private life under the most intensely public circumstances imaginable, where children do homework and families eat dinner and people try to sleep in rooms that every school child in the country can describe from a photograph. But beyond these functional identities, the building serves as something else. A mirror in which America can see itself if it is willing to look honestly. And what the full history of the White House reflects back is not entirely comfortable. The building was designed to embody Republican virtue and democratic ideals. It was raised by workers who were denied the most basic freedoms that Republic claimed to protect. It was burned by an empire that its residents were trying to defend against, rebuilt with a determination that reflected genuine national character, and maintained for decades past the point of structural safety, because admitting its fragility felt impossible for a building that had become synonymous with American permanence. It has sheltered presidents who expanded human freedom and presidents who systematically contracted it. It has been a location of decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost them in numbers that defy easy accounting. It has been photographed more often than almost any structure on Earth. And most of those photographs show only the South Lawn facade, the part that was designed to be seen, the part that projects dignity and authority, and the calculated impression of a building that has always known exactly what it was. The rest of the building, the service corridors, the carved names and old beams, the records of hired and slave labor in the National Archives, the floor that gave way under a piano leg, that part requires more effort to see. It requires willingness to look at the building not as a symbol of American aspiration, but as evidence of American reality. What the country actually did, what it actually built on, who it actually used and discarded and refused to name in the official record. The commemorations and acknowledgments that have emerged in recent decades represent genuine progress toward historical honesty. They cannot change who laid the first stones or under what conditions they labored. They cannot retroactively extend freedom to the men who built this monument to freedom while being denied it themselves. What they can do is insist that those men are part of the story, central to it, not peripheral, not optional, not a footnote that can be omitted when it's inconvenient. The White House still stands on its low hill above the Potomac. The same hill that was swampy and wooded and entirely unsuitable for a presidential mansion when the first workers began clearing it in the autumn of 1792. The same hill where the foundation stones were set by hands that the official ledgers reduced to line items. The same hill where an Irish immigrant's Georgian design, refined from memories of a Dublin townhouse, somehow became the face of the American presidency for all time. Every child on Earth knows what this address looks like. Not many of them know the full story of what it took to make it look that way, or whose labor made it possible, or how many times the building nearly failed to survive its own history. Now you do. The building that emerged from all of this, from the backroom dinner deal that chose a swamp over an established city, from the Irish immigrant's competition-winning design that borrowed its proportions from a Dublin townhouse, from the enslaved labor that set its first stones and maintained its daily operations for half a century, from the British soldiers who burned it and the national determination that rebuilt it faster than anyone thought possible, is not simply a house. It is a compressed version of American history itself. The aspirations and the failures, the ideals stated and the practices maintained, the things the country says about itself, and the things the building's own foundations quietly contradict. That is what makes the White House genuinely interesting, beyond the portraits and the chandeliers and the famous rooms that every tourist photographs. It is a building that has been asked to represent something that America has never fully achieved and has never stopped trying to become. A place where the gap between stated values and actual practice is literally built into the walls. A monument not to what America is, but to what America is still in the process of deciding it wants to be. Standing in front of it on any given afternoon, watching the tourists take their photographs and the flags catch the Washington wind. That is the question the building is still asking. Not who lived here, not what decisions were made here, but looking at everything this building cost and everything it took to keep it standing. What kind of country are you, actually, and what kind of country are you willing to become?